In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Lilac. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is an interesting and pleasant lighter purple that I've enjoyed using a bunch. Callifolio makes a ton of great inks, this being one of them. Now, there's very little tone variation by pen or by paper, for that matter. It does show on fountain pen friendly paper that it can shade, and when it does, it looks great. I see a bottle of this in my future sometime, hopefully. I really do like using this and have enjoyed it a whole lot more than I was really expecting to, and I don't know why I wasn't expecting to enjoy it a ton, but it's always nice to be wrong, and I was with my expectations going into this. Here is a great purple. Enjoy the review. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Diplomat Aero with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, it is quite a bit darker than you saw with that first writing, but here on the Clairfontaine, it's a beautiful, darker purple. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades very, very nicely, I think. Look at something on the top line, or almost, or every great on the second line. It's just beautiful to look at. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that we had with the standard. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get that great shading still going on. And I have to admit, I kind of would like that shading to be a little bit more extreme. But I think what's going on here looks really good and is not disappointing in any way. Like I said, I have been pleasantly surprised with this. Looking at the Fude nib, the tone that we get is exactly the tone that I want from this ink. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. Look at that beautiful shading. When I said I wanted this to be a bit darker, this is exactly how I like to see this ink. I'm just talking about it. I'm like, I think when I'm done with this, I need to go order a bottle. This is just so beautiful. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problems with this well-behaved ink. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with A noodler's Ahab with an extra fine nib. A noodler's Ahab with a medium nib. A noodler's Ahab with a 1.1 stub nib. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes Steno notebook. Looking at the standard Ahab writing, the tone we're going to get here is largely the tone that we're going to get on a lot of the non-fountain pen papers. So this is still a very good purple. It's the reason that I referred to it as a lighter tone was I used it on a lot of non-fountain pen paper. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't shade. It just gives a nice light purple tone. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that we had with the standard. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's not shading. It's not the kind of color that you will get out of a ballpoint or a rollerball, which I always enjoy when that happens, which is the beauty of fountain pen inks. So many you can't get any other way. Looking at the Fude nib, we get the same tone that we had with the gold and the standard nib. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. It does not shade. It is still a great tone. Now, just don't use a Fude nib on some of these papers and perhaps you don't have any problems, or maybe a little bit drier Fude would be a great solution. Looking at the back of the page, none of all of this bled through and touched the page underneath, which is great news, but obviously with the ghosting that's happening, you can't write back here. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in an AmPad Steno notebook. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, despite the tone of this paper, it is the same tone that we had with the last paper, which was white. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It is still clearly a very nice purple on this very yellow paper. So this is a much more opaque color than I kind of thought. I always like the yellow paper to see the changes. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone as the standard. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get no shading. Just solid performance. This is being predictable and boring is beautiful. I like knowing what I'm going to get. Looking at the Fude nib, we get the same tone as the standard Ahab and as the gold. We do get a tiny bit of feathering going on from this very wet pen. We do get a little bit of spread from this very wet pen on this non-fountain pen paper. We do not get any shading, and when it comes to non-fountain pen paper, when it does not shade, I generally take that as a good sign that it won't bleed. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ink got very deep into the paper as it did before, meaning you probably can't write on the back of the page, but none of this bled through and touched the page underneath. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a National Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AmPad nib. Strangely, this is a little bit darker than we had with the last pen, or last paper. A little bit lighter than it was with the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is giving us a little bit of shading similar to what we saw on the Clairfontaine. So there's a little give and take when it comes to this paper compared to some others in its performance. Looking at the gold nib, it is a little lighter than a standard nib on this paper. Now, it's the same tone that we had with the last papers, so back to being consistent. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is giving the tiniest hint of shade in a couple of areas, which is nice, but the shading in itself isn't very standout. You see it more in the word like shock on the first line where it goes darker to lighter to darker. Looking at the Fude nib, it is darker than we had with the gold or with the standard. It's a little bit darker, I think, than the last paper, but not as dark as it was with the Clairfontaine. We do get a little bit of feathering going on. You see it in his, in dread, in the F of very clearly. There's no spread, and there is just a little bit of shading coming through. Looking at the back of the page, you can see that you couldn't write on the back where there's the Fude. I think it's a little too much, but on the standard and the gold, I think there's no ghosting and no problem. Nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Birmingham Pen Company's Phipps Conservatory Verbena. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Violet Blue. Here is Noodler's North African Violet. Here is Pelikan 4001 Violet. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot Steno notebook. Looking at the standard AmPad nib, we get the same tone that we've had on the first of the non-fountain pen friendly papers, not the last one that was a little bit odd in its performance. Now here we get no feather, we get no spread. The shading that's going on is really well. I hope the fountain pen community picks up on this paper because it is, without a doubt, the best of the inexpensive paper I have ever found. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that we had with the standard AmPad. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get pretty darn good shading considering how inexpensive this paper is. I really want to know where this paper's made. I really want this paper in white, not just this yellow or maybe a cream tone. I need to petition to Office Depot or Office Max. Which one is this? Office Depot to get them to make this in bigger pads. Looking at the Fude nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had with the gold or the standard AmPad nib. It's a little bit lighter than the last paper, so Okay, but it's still quite a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Pretty consistent, I think. It's right about back to what we had on the other non-fountain pen friendly papers. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It is shading incredibly well. Nowhere near as well as the Clairfontaine, but still shading very well. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is not a problem. The heaviest ghost is, of course, the Fude, but you can probably write on the back of this page with no problems because nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a green ink by Montegrappa, they're green. Here is a shimmering gray ink by Diamine, they're Moondust. Here is a pink ink by Krishna, they're Bohemia. Here is a yellow ink by Krishna, they're Freedom Gold. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the standard AHAB nib, we get the same kind of tone that we got on the right pad. Quite a bit lighter than it is with the Clairfontaine. We do get feather. We do get spread. We do not get shading, which I'm taking as a good sign and saying, hopefully, this doesn't bleed through the 20-pound sponge. I mean, copy paper. Looking at the gold nib, it is about the same tone that we had with the standard AHAB. It is feathering a little bit. It actually feathers, I think, a little less. It does have a tiny bit of spread, but I think a little bit less spread, so it's doing incredibly well with that. It is not shading, which I'm keeping hopeful to mean that it's not going to bleed through, and I'm having some high hopes for this. Looking at the Fude nib, we get about the same tone that we had on the first of these writing samples, not the Clairfontaine. We do get a tiny bit of feathering, really minor. I want to say almost none, but there is a little. There is some spread going on, having something to do with how wet this pen is. There is no shading, which is leaving us in a position of hope. Looking at the page underneath, that hope is destroyed as all of these little circles are spots that it bled through and touched the page underneath. Seeing the back of the page, we completely understand why, as there is a lot of ghosting and you can't write back here. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This is very consistent and nice all the time. But I want that darker tone and the shading that I was getting with the Fude nib on the Clairfontaine. So I go for a super wet gusher of a fine, or maybe I'll just make that AHAB a bit wetter and really use this ink in it, because I think that in the writing from that pen, amazing. Just amazing. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.